We are in the middle of a sermon series called According to Christ, reading reality the way Jesus does. And what we're trying to do in this sermon series is really sort of be governed by John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, which says, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples, then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And so we're trying to, as people who desire to be disciples of Jesus and to be faithful to him and follow him and be set free by him, we're going to Jesus, to his teachings, to learn the truth. And so we're in this sermon series. This, I think, is week 5 of the sermon series of just really walking through the scriptures and looking at the things that Jesus taught. Before we get going here, I just want to think out loud a little bit for a second about the nature of trying to get somewhere, trying to go somewhere, sort of like the nature of, say, a path or a way or a road or any sort of way, a sort of bounded way of traveling from one place to another. And I'm specifically thinking of, how, say, you are maybe driving somewhere, if you have a car, or you're maybe biking somewhere in the city, and as you sort of you plug in the destination that you're trying to reach into your GPS, and as you're on your way following the directions, so you're pedaling along, if you miss a direction and you have a reliable GPS app, maybe if you're using Google Maps rather than Apple Maps, your GPS unit will update real time, and it will sort of it'll say, oh, you missed that direction. That's not a big deal. Okay. And it'll update and give you like a new turn. Right. And as you're on your way somewhere, as you're going somewhere, you have sort of a number of those that you can kind of rely on. There are a number of twists and turns in your journey, whichever way it may take and whichever way it may go, where you can sort of say, well, I missed that one, but I'm going to go straight here instead of turning right here. The GPS will update and it'll say, okay, now you turn right here instead, or turn left there instead, and it'll route you there. At some point, however, especially if you're driving, I don't know if it does this as much when you're biking, at some point you'll have, it's possible to make enough directional decisions in the execution of you're trying to get from point A to point B that the GPS won't be able to update your route anymore, right? And at that point, the GPS will say something like, make a U-turn, U-turn. And at that point, the GPS is sort of saying, turn around. You have to turn around. You're far enough off the path in terms of the range of acceptable options that you could take, the different ways that you could navigate to get from point A to point B. You're outside enough of those options that really there isn't sort of any other thing that you can do now to get back to that direction other than to turn back around and get on the route, right? And oftentimes, your GPS device will say, make a U-turn and proceed to the route, or, just on, I love it when they say proceed to the route. It's like they don't have any other suggestions for how you can get to the place you need to go. You sort of need to figure that on your own, and then they can direct you from there. And Jesus in the scriptures use the language of a path, or the idea of a walking and a going someplace a number of times throughout the scriptures. And what we're going to look at today, what we're going to think about today, is the question of what does Jesus say about the various paths that are on offer to us in life, and who speaks authoritatively about those paths, and where do those paths lead, and do they all lead to the same place? I think we know when we're traveling from one place to another, we know in our lived experience that not every road leads to the same place. And then if I want to get to a particular destination, I need to think carefully and deliberately about taking the path that will get me there. But sometimes perhaps when we think about bigger life issues or spiritual issues, we can maybe be tempted to think that there are a number of paths that all lead to the same place. Is that true? And what does Jesus teach about that? These are some of the questions that we'll be looking at today. I've titled today's sermon, For Some Have Wandered Off and Died. Will you pray with me as we get started? Heavenly Father, we come before you, and we just pause to be with you, Lord, and to be in your presence. And Lord, I just ask just for a special extra helping or portion of your grace and your mercy and your love, especially if just our scripture reading today just stirred up any anxiety for people or concern, Lord. I just pray, God, that you would just be present with us as we're trying to meet your Son and listen to his words. Would you really be present with us, God? And Lord, we need to meet with you. We need to meet with you so badly. And God, I just ask you in the name of Jesus that you would, through all the imperfection of Zoom and online church, Lord, that you would meet with us because we're just so thirsty for you. Lord, will you pour your Holy Spirit out on me now to preach and teach your word? We do that in the name of Jesus. Amen. So this text has a pretty clear logical structure that we're going to follow as we go through. The text is really governed by the sort of if-then logical relationship. If A is happening, then you should do B, Jesus says. So there's an if-then, and then Jesus later in the text is going to introduce the idea of a grounds for why the if-then statement is true. If A is true, then you should do B, and then there's a grounds for it. And we're just going to really follow that as we walk through. One of the major words that appears to us in this passage is the word stumbling. It comes from the Greek word skandalizo or skandalon, which as you're listening to that, you might hear the English cognate word scandal. So we could say here, if anyone causes one of these little ones sort of to scandal or to be scandalized in relationship to me. And here the translation renders it stumbling. And this is how scandalon is translated in the often how the scandalon is translated in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the idea of stumbling or being snared by something or being tripped up or sort of inhibited. And so implicit in that image is the idea of walking, And we could just examine that image for a second, because essentially here, by using the metaphor of stumbling, Jesus is saying that following God is like walking. It's like going somewhere, right? And not just like the motion of walking with your body, but sort of having a direction that you're pursuing, such that you could experience, right, a stumbling. You're trying to go, in one place, and you catch your foot on a stone, or the pavement in the concrete is slightly uneven, or a tree root has gotten up into the concrete in the sidewalk, and you just didn't quite see it, and you're walking on the sidewalk, and you catch and you stumble. Jesus is saying that following God can be seen through this sort of an image of a walking, and then someone as a result might be prone to stumbling. There are a number of reasons in the Old Testament why someone might stumble. One of the key ones is idolatry. In Psalm 106, verses 36, the text reads, "They worshiped their idols, which became a snare to them." And that word snare in the Greek translation of the Old Testament is skandalon, which became a stumbling block to them. There was a dynamic of God's people living among the nations that surrounded them in the ancient Near East, all their neighbors and all the divinities that their neighbors worshipped and all the practices that they followed. And God told them, you need to be really careful. You need to be really careful with your neighbors, because they worship other gods, and you're going to be tempted to worship their gods too, and they'll cause you a skandalon. They'll cause you to stumble. They'll become a snare for you. And so Jesus here in this passage is concerned about things that have entered in to the lives of his disciples and the lives of people that are causing them to stumble in their walking with God, inhibiting their ability to continue to walk faithfully and lovingly with God, things that are causing them to stumble out of faithful, life-giving walking with their God. Jesus says in the text, he says that there could be a number of causes here for stumbling, right? He said, if anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, so that anyone there is sort of any person causing another person to stumble. And then he zooms in on the idea of one of his own disciples stumbling. And he says, if your hand causes you to stumble, if your foot causes you to stumble, if your eye causes you to stumble. It could be easy for us to just think that Jesus is sort of repeating himself 3 times there, but there really are distinct domains of meaning that are identified here in the hand language, in the foot's language, in the eye language. And this even shows up in rabbinic literature, the different ways in which the hand and the eye in particular lead us in to different kinds of stumbling. For today, we could understand this by talking about the hand in terms of what we do, the foot in terms of where we go, and the eye in terms of who we look to, who or what we could say we look to. Our hands, they do things. We put them to work, and as we do things with our bodies, as we participate or don't participate in certain actions, we are either led or not led into areas and places where we could be prone and tempted to stumble. Our feet take us places. Our feet lead us into places. Our feet determine where we go. And depending on where we go and where we either are or aren't exposed to things in those places that, again, could cause us or lead us into stumbling out of a faithful, loving walking with God. Our eyes. The eye, in some ways, is perhaps the most challenging, because the eye is also linked to the heart. The eye doesn't just see things and then we sort of behold them and become magnetically attracted to them, but the eye then develops desires and appetites in the heart. And so there's a linking, a spiritual link right from the eye and to the heart, the seat of desire. And we look at things and become transfixed and are led into places where we might come into a stumbling. Of course, again, at the beginning of the passage, Jesus says, if anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, here these are people causing people to stumble. And of course, when we look at this and sort of think about stumbling for ourselves and what Jesus could be saying to us in this passage, it's important to note that Jesus, the only 2 tracks that we can sort of run on here in terms of thinking about the stumbling of people are really our own stumbling and the way we might be causing others to stumble. Jesus doesn't really give us an option here to think about ways in which we would sort of want to judge other people or sort of assess their stumbling. It's a really personal focus here in this passage, saying, am I stumbling? Am I causing myself to stumble? Am I causing other people to stumble? But there isn't any language in here about, like, if you see somebody else stumbling, you need to go and tell them right away, right? That's just not really a focus in this passage. And I think that can be a gentle and a helpful corrective, especially in a passage that's, is this powerful and full of language of this intensity. And so right off the bat here, when we think about stumbling, Jesus is bringing us into a place of just admitting a couple people here from the waiting room. Jesus is leading us into a place where we are invited to reflect on causes of our own stumbling. We're invited to reflect on causes of our own stumbling. And this is really governed by this word, if. If anyone causes, Jesus says, if your hand, if your foot, if your eye, if. The word if is an invitation from Jesus for you to say, are my hands causing me to stumble? Like, are there things that I'm doing that in the nature of doing them, I'm led away from faithful, life-giving walking with God? If. And if it opens up a whole series of hypotheticals that we can walk into and say, I'm really going to explore that hypothetical space with God and say, God, are there places where the things that I'm doing are leading me into stumbling. The same thing can happen when we think about our feet and where we go, and our eyes, who or what we look to. If those things, Jesus says, are causing you to stumble, if. And so we receive this invitation to Jesus from Jesus to humbly reflect on our own stumbling rather than being concerned about other people or judging them. We're really taking the opportunity to enter into a gentle assessment of ourself. Are there things that are there things that we are doing, or places that we are going, or people or things or forces that we are looking to that cause us in the life of faith to trip more often than not? So the first part, if something causes you to stumble. Jesus says, then remove. And he says, eliminate those things, eliminate the sources of your stumbling. The first image that Jesus uses to talk about this is the image of a millstone. A millstone was ancient technology for grinding grain or olives, for grinding things into pastes or grain that can be used to make different things or be consumed in different ways. And there were two sizes of millstones. One was a small, like hand grinder millstone. People, often women, would use them in their homes, and they'd sort of turn them and the stones would grind what was in between the stones. Then there's also a great millstone, which is very, very large. You're looking at a picture of one here. And this size of millstone, an animal would need to be harnessed to, and then the animal would walk and basically pull this millstone and turn it, and then it would grind. And this large millstone is the millstone that Jesus is actually talking about in this passage. When he says it would be better if a large millstone were hung around their neck, he's talking about this size of a millstone. So Jesus here, right, is using very extreme language to talk about the severity with which the severity of the situation of someone causing someone else to stumble. And actually in the Roman world, drowning people in this way would have been an imperial punishment for, say, thieves or people that they wanted to embarrass, right? Just in a similar way that, say, crucifixion was in some ways so shameful that it was kind of a fate worse than death. Being drowned in the sea, which the sea already in the ancient mind is sort of this place of chaos and lostness. And so to be drowned into the crushing deep of the water like that would have been a fate worse than death. And this is the first image that Jesus uses when he says, look, if anyone's causing someone to stumble, it would be better for them if they had a millstone of this size hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. The second image that Jesus uses is the image of cutting off or plucking out. And this is really interesting language for Jesus to use here, right? He says, if your hand's causing you to sin, cut it off. Your foot's, cut it off. Your eye, pluck it out. Because in the Old Testament context, there are various passages that expressed a real negative view towards anything that could be perceived as self-mutilation in any way. So no cutting yourself. There are even, in the Old Testament Levitical prohibitions against altering your appearance in certain ways. And really all of these things, aside from, just a basic sort of moral, ethical exhortation to not treat your body that way, are linked to idolatry in the Old Testament in some ways. And just as an example of this, when Elijah met the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal engage in ritual self-mutilation to try to get Baal to listen to them and to essentially defeat Elijah and Elijah's God. And this is what the text says. It says, then they, the prophets of Baal, called on the name of Baal from morning till noon, but there was no response. No one answered. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And so for Jesus to use this language is really striking, because for a first century Jew, it could have been language that would have been hard for them to enter into or really hang in there with Jesus on, because it sounds like he's sort of counseling self-mutilation. Of course, Jesus here is using metaphorical language to talk about the severity of which his followers should take dealing with things in their life that are causing them to stumble, right? There's metaphorical force here. And, just to be explicitly clear again, Jesus is certainly not counseling that anyone should take any of these actions and do them to themselves. Certainly, and this is very important, unlike the prophets of Baal, who felt like they needed to harm themselves in order to get God to listen, God explicitly does not need anyone to do that. And that is not why Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying, if your hand is causing you to stumble, in order to get God's attention, you should, cut off your hand, or in order to atone for it, you should cut off your hand. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, he's using this extreme language with metaphorical force to say, if something is in your life and it's causing you to stumble, the cost of stumbling is so high that you have to be ruthless in your elimination of that thing. Ruthless in your elimination of that thing. This text has played a big part in my own story. In February of 2004, I was 13, about to turn 14, and I was watching the Super Bowl, and it was the Super Bowl with Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson performing at the halftime show. And of course, there was the wardrobe malfunction, and I, as a 13-year-old, was very curious about that, and had a computer in my room. And so after the Super Bowl, I went and searched things about that event. And as I searched about them, I became exposed to the world of online pornography and was addicted to pornography until I was about 20, 21 years old. And it took me, a long time to really wake up to how devastating pornography was in my own life and what a high cost it was exacting from me. Pornography taught me to see people as objects. It hurt my ability to know what healthy intimacy looked like. It caused me to enter into patterns of deception and deceit, which made me an internally divided person. And it also made me a deceitful person with other people. There's a lot more that I could say about that. But when the Lord, when I was about 19 and 20, really began to get a hold of my life again, he very quickly began to put me on a path of identifying how devastating pornography was in my life, and to put me on a path of walking out of that. And there are a number of things that went into that. I, in particular, had a friend that I walked very closely with that, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without him. But this passage was wildly important for me, because once I allowed Jesus' language to enter into my own consciousness about pornography and what it was doing to me and how devastating it was, I began to see why Jesus' words here were so wise and so important. And if you're struggling with any sort of addictive thing that you feel like you don't have a good control over, or you're still in the midst of struggling with it, of course, there's many things to say. But this text in my own struggle played a very important role, because alongside personal growth and moral growth and awareness and strengthening of character, there was a part of me walking out of that was purely about me being ruthless with the patterns in my life that were making me more prone to engage in pornography. And I had to engage in reflective practice of saying, what are the patterns that are currently in my life, the structures, the systems, the rhythms, the devices of which I am not currently in control. And if I keep entering into them, they will continue to allow me to stumble. And I had to cut them out in some pretty ruthless ways. Because of the mercy of the Lord and graciousness that God had for me, and just putting the right set of people and resources in my life at the right time, I haven't looked at pornography for now almost a decade, but I wouldn't have gotten there if I hadn't allowed Jesus' words in this passage to speak to me about how severe the cost of my stumbling in this area was, and how ruthlessly I needed to deal with some aspects of my life that were allowing me to continue to stumble in those things. This is what Jesus says. He says, if you're recognizing something causing you to stumble, then, this is the then of the if then statement, then cut it out or cut it off. And this text invites us to see with real severity how certain ways of being, how certain practices, how certain actions in our speech, in our minds, in the places we go with our feet, and the things we look at with our eyes, and what we do with our hands, how severe those things are. They're not small things, Jesus says. The cost of stumbling is very high. And so Jesus says, if you're recognizing those things, then deal with them decisively. Deal with them decisively. So if you are stumbling, then eliminate those sources for or because of life. Because of life. And in all of these verses, Jesus says, if you're stumbling, then cut it out, because it would be better for you to enter into life without a hands than to enter into what Jesus calls hell or Gehenna and have both of your hands. Now, hell is a very, very loaded word, and different people mean different things by it. And of course, in our cultural context, many people have very bad experiences with the way that this has been spoken about. And you might even be having in this moment some concern or anxiety. So I just want to take some time to be really clear about, like, what are we talking about in the text here when we say hell? And what are we not talking about when we say hell? So first of all, the history behind the term, the Greek word here is the word Gehenna. Gehenna. And Gehenna is a transliteration ultimately of a Hebrew phrase that is Gai Hinnom. So the Hebrew is Gai Hinnom. And Gai Hinnom is a valley. It's the valley of Hinnom. And the Aramaic of that term then translated into Greek became Gehenna. So Gai Hinnom is Gehenna, and it gets rendered hell in our English Bibles. And Gai Hinnom, the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, was an actual place. It was a place just south of Jerusalem. And during the years of the monarchy, it had a really bad rap, and it was defiled by kings. I'm just going to read about the valley of Hinnom and what Ahaz did there. This is in 2 Chronicles chapter 28. It says, Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel and also made idols for worshiping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So the Valley of Hinnom is this place immediately south of Jerusalem, and it basically became a place of offering cult sacrifices to other gods, to gods that are not Israel's God, to gods that are not Yahweh, to the Baals or Molech, other gods of the nations. And because of that, it became a place that was very defiled. And so over time, people wanted to stop going there. And what it became was a trash heap. It became a big garbage dump. This is a map of Jerusalem. And what I want to point your attention to over here, you see right down here, it says Hinnom Valley. This is the south of the city. This is the Hinnom Valley as well. And this is the Kidron Valley over here. And then, the north end of the city and the south. And below the south end of the city, where the hill dumps down, the Hinnom Valley became a trash heap, and people would go there and take their stuff there and they would burn it. And so it was full of just waste and refuse. And so when Jesus says it's better that if your hand's causing you to stumble, for you to cut it off, then go into Gehenna with two hands, he's using a well-known historical physical reality as a metaphor for what happens spiritually. That Gehenna as a place of refuse and burning up of trash. Jesus says Gehenna, that physical image of the burning up of waste there is a mirror of a spiritual reality that stumbling can lead you into. Now, having said that, having given some of the context, what do we not mean? What do I not mean by hell? I'm going to come back to that in a second. Obviously, when we think of hell, most of us have some sort of probably like Dante's Inferno type image in our mind. And, we think of, spirits that are in a place eternally torturing people in some sort of way, right? And that image just is very large in our cultural imagination. And some of us maybe grew up in contexts where hell was spoken of in that way or used as sort of like a fear-based thing to sort of fear you into faith. And I just want to touch on that briefly. Dante's Inferno is a medieval text, and there are other medieval texts that sort of envisioned hell in this way. In the early church, there were a bunch of texts floating around before the church had sort of closed the canon. And one of the processes that the church sort of went through, and process isn't really the right word, but the church went through sort of the process of coming to acknowledge which texts of the early Christian texts, like the letters of Paul, the general epistles, the gospels, were authoritative, and which texts, even if certain communities thought that they were valuable, were not authoritative and were not going to be in the canon. And really what it means for a text to have been in the canon is that all Christians in the ancient world everywhere implicitly or explicitly affirmed that the texts that were included in the canon faithfully mediate God's words to God's people, and that they faithfully mediated the authority of Jesus via a link to an apostle that they had. There's a lot more to say about canonization, but I just want to bring in that context and then introduce to you a text called the Apocalypse of Peter. You've probably never heard of the Apocalypse of Peter, the Revelation of Peter, because it did not make it into the canon. This is an early 2nd century Christian text, and the Apocalypse of Peter is the earliest text that we have that paints a sort of Dante's Inferno vision of hell. In the Apocalypse of Peter, the text sort of has, it describes a sort of blessed realm for people that are saved. And then it uses like very Dante's Inferno type language to talk about what's happening in hell. And it gives, sort of list by list description of sort of what's going on. And I just want to share a little bit from that text with you. I'm not going to share anything particularly graphic from the text, but I just want to give you a flavor for what it's like. The narrator in the Apocalypse of Peter then says this: "And over against that place, the blessed place, I saw another squalid, and it was a place of punishment. And those who were punished there and their punishing angels had raiments dark like the air of the place. And there's a great lake full of flaming mire, in which were certain men that perverted righteousness, and tormenting angels afflicted them." And the rest of the text is sort of an unpacking of this vision. Now, the point that I want to make to you and why I'm introducing this to you is this: the Apocalypse of Peter was not accepted into the canon. In other words, the vision of hell that is found in Dante's Inferno and our sort of popular imagination, and maybe even some sort of hellfire and brimstone preaching that ultimately traces itself back to this text, the Revelation or Apocalypse of Peter, it was not accepted into the canon in the early church. In other words, the early church had an opportunity to include this vision of the end in the canon, and they said, this vision does not mediate the voice of God to God's people, and it does not mediate the authority of Jesus via the Apostle Peter. And it's actually very interesting that they didn't do that, because this text bears the name of Peter. You would think that any text that bear the name of someone who is such an important figure of the early church would get into the canon. But the early church, again, through this long process, came to recognize that it didn't matter that this text bared Peter's name. It didn't go in his authority. It did not mediate the perspective of Jesus, and it did not mediate God's voice to God's people. In other words, the church already in the first couple centuries said that this vision, which often is so strong in our minds, is not the faithful vision, the faithful Christian theological vision of what Jesus is talking about here when he speaks about Gehenna and how God's judgment works in general. I hope that the force of that point is landing for you, especially if you have had some negative experiences around talking about hell or this language, or if someone has wielded this teaching in a way that was inappropriate towards you, that the church saw this teaching and said no, and they said no to it. Now, of course, there are people in different corners of the church throughout history that have picked up on it, and of course, I can't be I can't keep people from articulating their own visions, but when the church had the opportunity to take this on in the early church, they said no, that does not faithfully mediate God's speech to humanity. So what does this teach then? This text, Matthew 9:42-50, Mark 9:42-50, what does it teach if it doesn't teach this sort of Dante's Inferno-esque hellscape? This is really what it teaches. It teaches that Jesus says that not all paths lead to the same place, and that there is a path to life and there is a path to death. This is consonant with Jesus' speech in other areas. For example, in Luke 13:23-24, he says, someone asked Jesus, "Lord, are only a few people going to be saved?" And he said to them, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and they will not be able to." In Matthew, he says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." And remember in our text, Jesus says it would be better for them. It would be better. The text literally reads more good. Jesus' concern here is not to pronounce judgment on people. His concern is to tell people, in light of his knowledge about the fact that there are some paths that lead to spiritual death. In light of that knowledge, Jesus is out to tell you what would be good for you. The concern is to tell you what would be better, what would be good, not to judge you, not to scare you, but to tell you Jesus knows. He knows at the end of the day where these paths lead. He is an authoritative spiritual GPS, if you will, and he knows when he needs to tell you, turn around. You need to make a U-turn and proceed to the root. Turn around. It would be good for you if you would do that. So Jesus' speech is consonant in this. Of course, even in the way he describes entering into these realities, it's clear that there's a difference between entering into life, which is what the text says. Jesus says it would be better for you to enter into life than your other option, which is being thrown or being cast out into a different path, right? So in one path, Jesus says, you are walking with God side by side and entering into something. And on the other paths, you are being thrown about. It might feel like you're in control at the moment or feel like you're being autonomous, but really you are passively being acted on. This certainly was my experience in waking up to how devastating pornography was in my own life, and realizing how out of control and how much I was being acted on, how I was not as strong or as powerful as I thought I was, and that really I was on a path of being thrown about rather than entering into anywhere on my own volition. Finally, I think that Jesus, in terms of our posture of entering into these realities, let's skip forward just a little bit, calls us to walk and proclaim that there is a path to life that Jesus teaches, and at the same time to be without judgment. And look, that means letting go of both judgment and anxiety. when it comes to judgment, we don't need, in order to affirm that we hold to Jesus' teaching that there is a path to life and a path to death, we don't need to run around trying to tell other people that they're on the path to death or whatever, right? And for many of us, that just sounds deeply unattractive model of faith. But we do need to affirm for ourselves and in proper moments share with people that we have discovered that Jesus has the path of life. So we let go any concern about judgments and we just say, look, we don't know where other people are in their hearts. And will not God, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right when he searches their heart? However, many of us might be feeling some sort of anxiety around the idea that there's a path to life and a path to death. And maybe we have family members or friends who we look at them and think, well, gosh, if I have to take this teaching on, I guess I have to say that they are or were on the path to death. And I don't want to do that, or that makes me feel very anxious for them. And I just want to say, and I don't have time to unfold all these now, but there are plenty of biblically sound options for thinking well about God saving people that have never heard the gospel, or that were really truly good people, but were just executing that in the religious tradition that they were brought up in. The scriptures say that God's going to analyze us according to our faith in Jesus, but also according to our works. That people who have lived good lives and sought to live good lives, that God will honor them and judge them accordingly. C.S. Lewis is a Christian author that's well loved and respected by basically all corners of the Christian world. And in his concluding book to the Chronicles of Narnia, he tells a story about a man named Emmet who was worshiping in his earthly life a different god, not Aslan, who's a representative for Jesus, but the god Tash. And Emmet wakes up sort of in the new heavens and the new earth and realizes that he's in Aslan's country, and he feels bad. He says to Aslan, I've been worshiping Tash my whole life. I haven't been worshiping you, so I don't know why I'm here. And I just want to read some of this exchange to you. Emmet said, Alas, Lord, I am no son of thine, but I'm a servant of Tash. He answered, he being Aslan, Child, all the service thou hast done to Tash, I account as service done to me. Aslan goes on saying, not because Tash and I are one, but because we are opposites. I take to me the services which thou hast done to him. For I and Tash are of such different kinds that there is no service which is vile that can be done to me, and none which is not vile can be given to him. Emmet continues, I also said, for the truth constrained me, Yet I have been seeking Tash all my days. Beloved, said the glorious one, unless thy desire had been for me, thou wouldst not have sought so long and so truly, for all find what they truly seek. And here C.S. Lewis unfolds a beautiful vision of biblical Christ-centered inclusivism, where Emmet here stands in essentially for those who, as C.S. Lewis would say, I think, seeking Jesus without knowing that they were seeking Jesus, doing the best that they had with the information that they had in the time that they had, and that Jesus will look at them and say, you were looking for me all along, and I know that because I am the just judge, and I know what is in your hearts. And so following Jesus and affirming that Jesus knows what he's talking about when he says that not all paths lead to life does not need to put us into a place of judgment or anxiety about other people. We can also confess with Abraham, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Some concluding thoughts. This passage ends with a really strange couple lines. Everyone will be salted with fire. And then this discussion about salt being good. I'm going to wrap up here, so I won't take a ton of time. But the idea of being salted with fire, in Leviticus, there's a passage where God tells the people to put salt on their offerings, make sure that they put the salt that belongs to God to their offering. And so there's a sense here in which we are salted by this teaching about there being a path to life and a path to death. And we have to decide if we will allow ourselves to be salted by this teaching and thus be an offering to God. Jesus goes on to say, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? If we decide not to be salted by this teaching and other hard things that Jesus says that challenge us, and frankly, that we stumble over ourselves sometimes, Jesus is perhaps saying to us, what good is salt if it's not salty? And what good are disciples of Jesus that don't listen to the teachings of Jesus? So we have to allow ourselves to be salted by these things, which means um, giving ourselves as offerings to Jesus, even when Jesus says difficult things. And finally, as we've talked about stumbling for this whole sermon, Jesus is talked about in multiple places in the New Testament as himself a stumbling block. And you might be feeling that right now. You might be feeling like I'm tripping over the teachings of Jesus. And if you're feeling that right now, I just want to bless you and affirm you and affirm you in your experience. I don't think that Jesus is surprised by that or upset at you about that. And I also want to put two paths before you. When we're stumbling over Jesus, when we're tripping over him, we essentially have two paths. We can choose to take the path of saying that Jesus needs to change and get out of my way, and then I'll stop stumbling over him. And the emphasis is put on Jesus changing. Or we can take the other path of saying, I'm stumbling over Jesus because there are aspects of me that need to change to come more fully into a line with Jesus. And I just want to set those before you and encourage you to enter into your own, perhaps, period of reflection and prayerful conversation with God to discern where you are and is something causing you to stumble. And if it's Jesus, who needs to change? Does Jesus need to change? Or are we gently being invited to consider the idea that perhaps we need to instead?